The room was still but not silent. It carried the hum of television cameras, the clicking of keyboards, the restless shifting of reporters who knew history sometimes announced itself in whispers before it roared. At the center sat Jim Jordan, his sleeves rolled high, his voice sharp and defensive. He had spent years mastering the art of bluster, yet on this night, bluster was failing him. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward with the poise of someone who had carried far heavier battles than this. Her eyes didn't blink, her voice didn't tremble. She asked the kind of question that sliced through noise, direct, legal, undeniable. The kind of question no amount of shouting could dodge. "Congressman Jordan," she said slowly, as though weighing every syllable, "can you explain under oath the legal basis for your claims?" The chamber seemed to contract around those words. For a moment, even the air felt charged, as though it too waited for his answer. Jordan opened his mouth, but the sound that came out wasn't authority. It was hesitation. He shuffled his papers, his jaw tightening. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the beads of sweat beginning to form at his temple. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. This wasn't the swaggering Jordan they had seen countless times on cable news. This was a man cornered by the simplest of challenges, to back up his bluster with fact. He stammered, tried to pivot, but Crockett's gaze didn't move. The contrast was magnetic, her calm against his chaos, her precision against his stumbling detours. It was more than a clash of personalities. It was a collision of values. Reporters would later describe it as a seismic moment, the instant when the energy in the hearing flipped. What had begun as another routine political spectacle suddenly carried the weight of a showdown, truth versus noise, dignity versus arrogance. And yet, the full impact hadn't even arrived, because this was only the first crack in Jordan's armor. The room hadn't seen the unraveling to come, the avalanche of exposure that would leave one lawmaker diminished and another elevated as the voice of unflinching resolve. But what unfolded next would not just embarrass a congressman. It would expose everything he had tried to hide. The hearing was never supposed to be ordinary. From the moment it was announced, pundits framed it as a test not just of personalities, but of the very credibility of America's oversight process. The committee chamber, usually a sterile stage for endless jargon and partisan point scoring, had transformed into a theater where the nation's values themselves felt on trial. Every network had their cameras rolling. Every reporter had their notepad open. And every American who tuned and sensed that something bigger than politics was about to unfold. Oversight hearings carry a peculiar weight. They are supposed to strip away theater and dig for truth, yet too often they dissolve into shouting matches designed for sound bites. But this time was different. The stakes were not abstract. They touched on the very questions of law, accountability, and the moral authority of the country's leaders. For Jim Jordan, the performance was an opportunity to reassert dominance, to project toughness, to drown scrutiny in the noise of indignation. For Jasmine Crockett, it was the moment to demonstrate that the law was more than a weapon for the powerful, that it could also be a shield for the people. Every viewer knew these dynamics even if they couldn't name them. They could feel it in their bones as the back and forth began. The room was charged, and the battle lines were not just Democrat versus Republican, but integrity versus evasion. What Crockett understood, what Jordan never fully grasped, was that millions of Americans were not tuning in for spectacle alone. They were watching to see who would speak for them, who would honor their sense that rules must matter, that accountability cannot be reserved only for the weak. The significance grew heavier with every minute. For Jordan, the risk was humiliation, his brand built on dominance cracking under the spotlight. For Crockett, the reward was resonance, her calm mastery offering validation to those who had long waited for someone who wouldn't flinch when bullies raised their voices. The chamber became a crucible where reputations would either be reforged in steel or collapse into dust. And beyond the chamber, the ripple was already beginning. Social media feeds lit up with snippets, gifs, half-heard quotes. "Did you see Crockett just now? Jordan looks nervous. This feels different." The narrative was forming before the climax had even arrived. That is why every second mattered. Every pause, every stumble, every question carried consequences far beyond the walls of Congress. This was not about who could yell louder. It was about who would be remembered. Oversight, credibility, the very trust of the people in the rule of law, it was all on the line. The danger for Jordan was not merely that he might lose an exchange. It was that the mask might slip, that the bluster could be revealed as hollow, that millions might see in real time the unraveling of a man who had built his career on intimidation rather than answers. And for Crockett, the opportunity was dazzling. To stand tall, to be unflappable, to demonstrate that knowledge and poise could not only withstand chaos but dismantle it piece by piece. It was a chance to rewrite the story, not just her own, but the story of what strength looks like in American politics. Viewers who tuned out early had no idea they'd missed the most unforgettable takedown of the year. Jim Jordan's reputation didn't emerge overnight. For years, he cultivated an image as Congress's bulldog, the lawmaker who never wore a jacket, always on the offensive, always ready to bark down opponents. His fans loved it. They saw in him the scrappy energy of a street fighter, someone unafraid to raise his voice, cut off an answer, or turn a hearing into a one-man show. To them, he was strength incarnate, the very picture of law and order. But peel back the surface and a more complicated picture emerges. Jordan's outbursts were often less about substance and more about dominance. His interruptions weren't born of precision, but of panic, an instinct to control the narrative before uncomfortable truths surfaced. Colleagues knew it, witnesses dreaded it, and reporters noted the pattern. When pressed on specifics, Jordan shifted, evaded, or shouted so loudly that the room forgot he had never answered. This tactic served him well in an era when noise often drowned nuance. He could storm through a 5-minute questioning period and leave viewers with the impression of a warrior, even if no actual facts had been established. It was performance politics, and Jordan was a master actor. But like any act, it only worked so long as no one stopped the performance to ask for receipts. And that was the contradiction at the heart of his persona. He was a man who preached accountability yet bristled when accountability knocked at his own door. He thundered about the sanctity of rules, yet bent them in practice to suit his cause. He proclaimed himself a defender of the Constitution, but when the hard, legal questions arose, he sidestepped, redirected, or lashed out. His strength was only real when untested. Inside Washington, this contradiction was an open secret. Off the record, aides rolled their eyes at his antics. Some admired his tenacity, yes, but many understood that his fury was a shield, a loud distraction from the hollowness beneath. He projected confidence, but it was the kind that cracked under pressure, the kind that feared silence more than anything else. For silence demanded answers, and answers required truth. Jordan had learned to survive in the noise. Cable news rewarded it. Fundraising emails thrived on it. Clips of his red-faced tirades made the rounds on social media, celebrated by supporters who didn't care whether he was correct, only that he was combative. The culture of political theater elevated him, giving him a stage where his refusal to yield was seen as bravery rather than insecurity. But the thing about bluster is that it can never stand forever. Sooner or later, the mask slips. Sooner or later, someone calls the bluff. And when that happens, the man who built his image on shouting suddenly looks very small. In that hearing room, as Jasmine Crockett asked her pointed questions, the fragility of Jordan's armor began to show. The same tactics that once made him untouchable now revealed their limitations. Loudness didn't answer legal standards. Interruptions didn't erase the demand for clarity. For once, his greatest weapon, noise, was useless against someone who refused to flinch. And the irony was brutal. The congressman who claimed to be the champion of law and order found himself dodging the simplest legal questions. The man who demanded accountability from others twisted in his seat to avoid providing it himself. The image of strength began to fracture, and beneath it was not a warrior but a man exposed. This was the Jordan that few of his supporters ever truly saw, not the bulldog but the cornered fighter, thrashing against questions he could not answer. The contradictions piled high. He wanted to be feared, but he was afraid of silence. He wanted to be respected, but he had built his career on spectacle. He wanted to look strong, but real strength was slipping through his fingers the moment Crockett refused to play his game. And that is why the stakes of this clash mattered so deeply. It wasn't just a debate over facts or procedures. It was the unmasking of a persona, the slow-motion collapse of an image carefully maintained through years of noise. The audience didn't just see a lawmaker fumbling. They saw the crumbling of the myth he had built around himself. Jordan had walked into the hearing confident he could control it, that his usual playbook of interruptions and outrage would keep him above water. Instead, he found himself dragged into a current he could not manage, against an opponent who wasn't rattled by the storm but sharpened by it. And that was the beginning of the end, because arrogance, no matter how loud, is brittle. It can stand against hesitation, it can even stand against fear, but it cannot withstand composure. But arrogance only survives until it meets someone who refuses to be intimidated. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever sat across from Jim Jordan, before her words carried the weight of millions listening for dignity and truth, she was a fighter of a very different kind. Her story did not begin in marble halls or in the spotlight of national hearings. It began in the quieter, harsher places where the fight for justice is not televised, courtrooms where the defendant can barely afford representation, neighborhoods where systemic neglect hangs in the air heavier than the heat, homes where families whisper that the system was never meant for them. Crockett learned early what it meant to be underestimated. As a black woman in law, she entered spaces where the assumption was that she was too young, too emotional, too untested. Those assumptions were her sharpening stone. Every sneer, every dismissal, every patronizing smile from colleagues who thought she'd never hold her own only fueled her resolve. While others wielded privilege like armor, she built hers from persistence. Her legal career was not designed for prestige, it was built for people. She took on cases that didn't promise glamour but demanded courage. Civil rights, racial justice, defending those society had written off, these were not abstract causes to her. They were neighbors, friends, reflections of her own lived experience. To Crockett, the law was never a stage for personal gain. It was a tool to carve fairness into a system that too often tilted against the vulnerable. That work came with storms. Standing for civil rights in America has always meant standing in the crosshairs of hostility. She faced courtrooms where judges looked past her, opposing counsels who spoke down to her, and political forces eager to label her angry or radical the moment she raised her voice for justice. But storms never broke her. They trained her. Every raised eyebrow she endured, every attempt to silence her, forged the poise she carried into that congressional chamber. And it wasn't just professional battles that shaped her, it was personal sacrifice too. The endless hours preparing cases with no guarantee of victory. The moments of exhaustion where she questioned if change was even possible. The loneliness of being one of the few willing to stand where it was hardest to stand. These were her tests, and each one etched into her the patience, the clarity, the calm that would later define her public presence. What made Jasmine Crockett powerful was not only her knowledge of the law but her lived connection to its consequences. When she spoke, she wasn't merely citing statutes. She was giving voice to those who had no seat at the table. When she challenged a figure like Jim Jordan, she wasn't just defending herself. She was defending every person who had ever been bulldozed by bluster, every community drowned out by arrogance. Her presence in that room was a victory in itself, a visible defiance against the gatekeepers who once told her she did not belong. And this is why her calm mattered so much. Crockett didn't meet Jordan's aggression with aggression. She didn't meet arrogance with arrogance. She met it with the same stillness she had cultivated in countless battles before, the unshakable knowledge that truth, when spoken clearly, carries more force than the loudest interruption. That calm wasn't weakness, it was her sharpest weapon. There is a particular strength in those who have lived on the margins of power. They understand both the cruelty of being unheard and the fire of finally having a platform. Crockett carried both truths with her. Every question she asked Jordan carried the echoes of 1,000 ignored questions from those who never had a microphone. Every refusal to be rattled carried the weight of communities who had long been told their dignity didn't matter. She was not debating just for herself. She was debating for them, and the audience watching, progressives, immigrants, people of color, those weary of the constant spectacle of politics, felt that connection. They saw in her poise their own desire for validation, their own yearning for someone who could hold the powerful accountable without flinching. She became, in that moment, more than a lawmaker. She became a vessel for the pride and resilience of every unheard voice. Her journey had prepared her for this stage more thoroughly than Jordan could have imagined. While he perfected the art of performance, she had perfected the art of endurance. While he built his brand on interruptions, she built hers on listening, learning, and then striking with precision. He was an actor in a play. She was a fighter in real life. And when the two worlds collided, only one would stand unshaken. That is what made this clash electric. It wasn't simply another partisan skirmish. It was the meeting of two paths, one forged in arrogance and performance, the other forged in struggle and purpose. For viewers at home, it was validation that truth-tellers still exist, that calm strength can still outshine chaos. For those who had felt invisible, Crockett's presence was a mirror that reflected back their worth. And this night, all those lessons would converge into a single, unforgettable moment. The sparring began subtly. Crockett leaned into the microphone, her voice level, her diction precise. "Congressman Jordan," she said, "you've made repeated claims about the legality of these actions. Could you cite the statute you believe applies?" It was a simple question on paper, but in practice, it was a scalpel. Jordan blinked, shuffled his notes, and instead of answering directly, launched into a sweeping monologue about partisan overreach, weaponized government, and his well-worn refrain about political witch hunts. His words tumbled out quickly, sharp but unanchored. Crockett waited. She didn't interrupt, didn't take the bait. When he finished, she nodded politely and asked again, this time narrowing the frame. "Respectfully, sir, that does not answer the question. What statute? What legal authority?" His voice rose a decibel. "Everyone knows this is political. Everyone knows." "Congressman," she cut in softly but firmly, "the law does not work on what everyone knows. The law works on text, precedent, and accountability. Can you identify it, yes or no?" The shift in the room was immediate. Reporters' heads turned. Staffers leaned forward. In the back rows, a few muffled chuckles escaped. On Twitter, hashtags were already starting to appear. "Answer the question." Jordan's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, pointing a finger, his voice now booming. "You don't get to lecture me about accountability. I've spent my career fighting." But Crockett was unflinching. "Then it should be easy for you to cite the law. Which one is it?" Her calmness only amplified his fluster. It was contrast made visible, his volume against her clarity, his heat against her cool steel. Gasps rippled when he tried to pivot again, insisting that the American people see through this charade. Crockett raised an eyebrow and let silence hang for just long enough to make the point. He was evading, and everyone knew it. On social media, clips began to circulate in real time. "Jordan is sweating," one user wrote. Another posted, "Crockett is serving him the law on a silver platter and he's choking on it." Memes were already forming from screenshots of his clenched jaw against her calm smile. She pressed once more, stepping deliberately through the framework. "Congressman, when we talk about legality, we're not dealing with slogans. We're dealing with statutory authority, precedent, case law. If you have the foundation, present it now. If not, then the record shows the emptiness of your claims." His response was louder but not sharper. Each sentence blurred into the next, a storm of grievances without substance. The more he raised his voice, the more obvious it became. He had no answer. And in that moment the room itself seemed to turn. This was no longer Jordan's performance. It was Crockett's stage. Every word she spoke carved the contrast deeper. Every time he dodged, her credibility soared. What he thought was a show of strength became the theater of his unraveling. The drama rose with every exchange, tension curling tighter like a rope ready to snap. Crockett never wavered, her questions cutting in sequence, methodical, relentless. Jordan swung at shadows, drowning in his own noise. The audience watching at home could feel it, the slow tightening of a trap around a man who had thrived for years on intimidation, now finding it powerless. Then came the question Jordan could not escape. There are moments in politics when time seems to slow, when every syllable is weighted, when every pause becomes a drumbeat echoing in the ears of millions. Jasmine Crockett knew this moment well. She had prepared for it, lived for it, and now she stood ready to deliver it. The room was tight with tension, as though every camera lens, every pair of eyes, every breath was waiting for what came next. She leaned forward, voice steady but sharpened to a point. "Congressman Jordan," she began, "you've had multiple opportunities to answer a straightforward legal question, and each time you've chosen slogans over substance. So let's make this very plain. Either you can cite the law or you cannot." The chamber went still. A single cough broke the silence in the gallery, followed by the shuffling of papers from staffers who suddenly seemed very interested in their notes. Jordan opened his mouth, but hesitation clung to him like a shadow. He glanced at his pile of papers as if a statute might suddenly leap from the margins. Nothing did. He stammered, reaching for volume instead of clarity. "Everyone knows this is a political witch hunt." Crockett cut him cleanly, her voice rising just enough to slice through. "Congressman, I didn't ask for your feelings. I asked for the law. Surely a champion of accountability has that ready at hand." Gasps flickered through the chamber. It was the kind of retort that hit harder because it was delivered without anger, without theatrics, just an attorney's scalpel drawing a bright red line under his failure. Jordan shifted in his chair. His shoulders rose, his voice pitched higher. "This is a joke, an absolute joke. The American people see what you're doing here." "Which American people?" Crockett's interruption was surgical. "The ones who rely on facts or the ones who settle for sound bites? You still haven't cited the law." The silence that followed was devastating. It wasn't the silence of disinterest, but of impact, every listener waiting, sensing that the exchange had already begun to tilt beyond repair for Jordan. Crockett didn't rush. She let the pause linger, understanding that sometimes silence was its own form of power. Then she pressed again, slower this time, as if speaking to a defendant who had run out of alibis. "Congressman Jordan, please identify the statute or acknowledge that you cannot." Jordan fumbled, flipping through his notes, his frustration growing more visible with every second. The veins in his neck strained as he barked about bias, about the so-called weaponization of government, about anything but the question at hand. Reporters scribbled furiously. Phones buzzed as social media lit up. Clips of his avoidance spread like wildfire. Jordan dodges again. Crockett is dismantling him piece by piece. Memes began forming in real time, screenshots of his red face captioned with "still no answer." Crockett, sensing the collapse, leaned back slightly, her calmness in stark relief against his chaos. "You see, Congressman, this is the difference between performance and proof. You can raise your voice all night long, but without the law it is empty noise. The people deserve more than noise." The words landed like a gavel. Behind her, a staffer fought to suppress a grin. Across the aisle, a few heads tilted downward, hiding smirks behind their notes. Even among Jordan's allies, the discomfort was palpable. Jordan, now visibly rattled, tried one last deflection. "The real issue here is corruption." But Crockett pounced, her voice rising into a rhythm that carried the cadence of a closing argument. Corruption is precisely why we demand statutes. Corruption is why accountability matters. Corruption is why you should be able, at the very least, to back up your claims with the law you so loudly champion. So again, Congressman, what is it? The repetition hammered home his failure. It was not anger, it was inevitability. Each time she asked, each time he dodged, his credibility eroded like sand beneath the tide. For the first time, Jordan's words faltered. His mouth opened, but nothing emerged. The stammer hung in the air like a confession. Viewers at home leaned forward, some whispering at their screens, others already typing into their timelines. He has nothing. Crockett's eyes locked on him, unflinching. I'll take your silence as the answer it is. The chamber seemed to exhale all at once. A wave of whispers, gasps, and barely contained laughter rippled through the audience. Reporters exchanged glances. The clip was already viral before it ended, destined to be replayed for weeks to come. But Crockett wasn't finished. She knew that moments like this weren't just about exposure, they were about clarity. She leaned back in her chair, adjusted her microphone, and delivered the line that would echo far beyond the chamber. Congressman Jordan, accountability is not optional. You don't get to demand it of others while refusing it yourself. The law doesn't bend for bluster, and truth doesn't answer to volume. Tonight, the record shows exactly who has the facts and who has only fury. The words fell with finality, sharp and deliberate, the kind of conclusion that lawyers spend a lifetime hunting. And in that instant, Jordan's collapse was complete. His hands fidgeted, his gaze dropped, his once commanding presence reduced to the posture of a man exposed. Cameras captured every detail, the flush in his cheeks, the frustration in his eyes, the stillness of Crockett's composure. The contrast was cinematic, a bully deflated, a truth-teller triumphant. On Twitter, hashtags exploded. Crockett crushes Jordan, legal masterclass, mic drop moment. TikTok edits popped up within minutes, set to dramatic music, replaying her demand for the statute followed by his speechless hesitation. Late-night producers clipped the footage for monologues before the hearing had even adjourned. Inside the chamber, it felt like the floor itself had shifted. Crockett hadn't just won the exchange, she had rewritten the narrative. In the theater of politics, she proved that calm, clarity, and truth could still rise above chaos. And yet, even as the moment reverberated, it was clear this was only the beginning of the fallout. What had started as a routine hearing had become a cultural flashpoint, a viral storm, a rallying cry for those hungry for accountability. By the time she delivered her final blow, the chamber itself seemed to erupt. The exchange ended, but the moment refused to stay inside the chamber. Within minutes, clips of Crockett's takedown spread across every corner of the digital world. Twitter lit up like a switchboard during a crisis, hashtags rising with breathtaking speed. Jordan exposed, Crockett crushes, legal masterclass. Users clipped the exact second Jordan stammered, slowing it down frame by frame, replaying his faltering expression as if it were a sports highlight. TikTok edits sprang up before the hearing had even adjourned. One viral post paired Crockett's question, "Which statute, Congressman?" with the sound of a game show buzzer after Jordan's silence. Another used dramatic orchestral music, cutting between Crockett's calm face and Jordan's frantic gestures, ending with the words, "And that's how you dismantle a bully." Each post racked up millions of views in hours. Instagram Reels and Facebook shares added to the frenzy. Screenshots of Crockett's calm expression circulated with captions like, "When you know the law, you don't need to shout." Memes flooded in. Jordan's red face photoshopped into a cartoon volcano, Crockett portrayed as a superhero wielding a legal brief instead of a sword. The humor was endless, but so was the admiration. Commentators jumped in, unable to resist. A CNN analyst called it a surgical legal demolition. MSNBC's primetime hosts replayed the footage with slow-motion commentary, marveling at Crockett's precision. Even conservative outlets, while bristling, could not ignore the spectacle. Jordan was caught flat-footed, one reluctantly admitted, though they quickly tried to shift the blame onto unfair questioning. Late-night comedy had a field day. Monologues practically wrote themselves. One host mimicked Jordan stammering, fumbling for invisible papers. Another leaned into the absurdity, quipping, "When you claim to be Mr. Law and Order, it helps to actually know the law." The audience roared, the laughter carrying Crockett's triumph into households that rarely tuned into congressional hearings. But beyond comedy, there was validation. Supporters of Crockett flooded her social media accounts with messages of gratitude and pride. "You spoke for us," one wrote. "Finally, someone held him accountable." Another added, "As an immigrant, watching you stand so strong gave me chills." Hashtags weren't just jokes, they were affirmations, a collective cheer for dignity over arrogance. The ripple effect reached far. Grassroots organizers used the moment to energize their communities, framing it as proof that persistence pays off. Civic groups circulated the clip as a teaching tool on the importance of legal knowledge in the face of bluster. Young law students shared it like scripture, a reminder that clarity always outlasts chaos. Even political allies weighed in. Tweets poured in from across the spectrum of progressive leaders. "This is what courage looks like. A masterclass in composure. Crockett just showed America the power of truth." It wasn't just praise, it was positioning, recognition that a new voice had arrived on the national stage with undeniable force. For Jordan, the fallout was harsher. Clips of his collapse overshadowed every talking point he had tried to make. The more he appeared on television to spin the exchange, the more viral the original footage became. Attempts to dismiss Crockett as disrespectful backfired, only reinforcing her poise by contrast. His allies shifted awkwardly, struggling to change the subject, while his critics relished the irony. The self-styled bulldog undone by the simplest of questions. And through it all, the sense of cultural resonance deepened. It wasn't just a skirmish in Washington, it was a reflection of a broader hunger. Americans weary of noise and evasion found in Crockett's calm dismantling a moment of relief, almost catharsis. The laughter, the memes, the hashtags, they were all signs of a deeper recognition that truth had won, if only for a night. But beyond the laughter and memes, something deeper was stirring. In the days that followed, as the dust of memes and commentary began to settle, Jasmine Crockett chose not to revel in the viral fame. Instead, she reframed the moment with the same clarity she had wielded in that chamber. To her, it was never about humiliating Jim Jordan. It was about reminding the nation that truth still mattered, that the law was not a toy for the powerful to twist, and that dignity could stand tall against intimidation. She spoke in interviews with a quiet strength, emphasizing that the exchange wasn't about personalities but principles. "This isn't a game of who can shout the loudest," she said. "It's about who can stand on the side of justice and prove it." That sentiment resonated far beyond politics. Teachers replayed her words in classrooms. Parents shared them with their children. For many, it became a reminder that integrity was still a force to be reckoned with. The universal themes rose like a tide. Justice over bullying, dignity over arrogance, clarity over chaos. Crockett's performance wasn't just legal sharpness. It was a symbol of something people craved in a fractured time. The belief that even against powerful, arrogant opposition, a steady voice of reason could cut through. Audiences felt it. "She showed me what it means to stand firm," one supporter wrote. Another said, "Watching her, I saw my own struggles reflected, the times I stayed silent when someone tried to intimidate me. Next time I'll stand straighter." The moment had leapt from politics into personal lives, empowering people to find their own strength in everyday confrontations. The symbolism grew. Crockett became, in the public eye, more than just a congresswoman. She was a reminder of resilience itself, the idea that America's greatest weapon against corruption wasn't rage but resolve. Against the theatrics of shouting and bluster, she offered discipline and dignity. Against evasion, she offered knowledge. And against arrogance, she offered justice. In a nation often divided by shouting matches, this encounter revealed a different kind of power, the power of calm defiance. It carried echoes of civil rights leaders, echoes of every underdog who had ever stood up against giants and refused to be moved. Her calm stare across that table had become more than a viral moment. It had become a lesson. The lesson was simple yet profound. America doesn't belong to those who bully or intimidate. It belongs to those who believe in justice enough to defend it, even when the odds are stacked high. Crockett's exchange reminded people that the law itself was never meant to be weaponized by the arrogant, but protected by the courageous. And so, the hearing lived on not just as a political skirmish but as a moral parable, a test of what happens when arrogance collides with integrity, a reminder that when noise fills the room, it takes one voice, steady and unshaken, to bring the truth back into focus. By the time Crockett reflected on that night, she didn't claim victory for herself. She extended it outward, to every unheard voice she felt she carried into that chamber. "I wasn't just speaking for me," she said softly. "I was speaking for everyone who's ever been told to stay quiet, to stay in their place, and I'll keep speaking until those voices are heard." Her words settled with the resonance of a vow, an oath carried not just on her shoulders, but on the hopes of those who had cheered her on. This wasn't just Jordan's failure. It was America's resilience on display, a reminder that the spirit of justice can still triumph over arrogance. And the audience watching didn't just feel entertained. They felt proud. They felt validated. They felt empowered. But Crockett's story that night wasn't finished, because every great lesson carries with it a call to action. And so the story came full circle. The title promised a destruction, and it delivered, but not the kind that comes from shouting matches or red-faced tantrums. Jasmine Crockett destroyed Jim Jordan with something far more lasting: intellect, composure, and an unshakable command of the law. In a chamber built on noise, she proved that clarity can be louder than bluster, that truth can cut deeper than any insult. Her triumph wasn't just about dismantling one congressman's evasions. It was about showing America that courage doesn't always roar. It can also speak calmly, ask the right question, and refuse to yield until justice is heard. Crockett's voice became more than her own. It became the voice of every person who has ever faced down arrogance and refused to be silenced. In the end, the values were unmistakable: truth over lies, courage over cowardice, dignity over arrogance. These aren't just political talking points. They're the foundation of what it means to believe in a better, fairer America. Watching her, we were reminded that the battles in these hearing rooms aren't just about policy. They're about the kind of nation we want to be. And now the story continues with you. If this moment inspired you, if you felt the pride, the validation, the spark of justice, don't let it stop here. Share this video with your friends so they can witness what happens when arrogance finally meets accountability. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. What did this exchange mean to you, and how do you see these values in your own life? Most importantly, subscribe and join this growing community of justice seekers, truth tellers, and everyday people who believe dignity will always outlast noise. Because this isn't just Jasmine Crockett's fight, it's ours. And together, we can ensure the truth is never drowned out.